Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Somewhat Scholarly. My name is Alan Hibbert, and today I want to walk you through the Blockchain Trilemma, which is a trade-off between security, scalability, and decentralization. And today I want to pay particular attention to decentralization. There is so much nonsense, nonsense going around the crypto community about what decentralization is, if it's important, is it good, should you have it, should you not, what constitutes a decentralized network and what doesn't, which project is more decentralized than another. It's crazy. It really, really, really is crazy. And I've noticed from reading different websites, white papers, articles on Medium, Quora, Twitter, all over the place, that almost everybody who uses the word decentralization doesn't define it, or if they do define it, they switch their definition as they're speaking about it, which is a logical fallacy. So in this section down here, I'm going to give you an example of a logical fallacy, and hopefully you can internalize that and you'll be able to pick up on when other people mess this up. Usually it's accidentally. I don't think they're doing it on purpose. And then here we're going to explore the exact logical fallacy that I see people making in terms of decentralization. Okay, so first let me explain this trilemma. Basically a trilemma, just like a dilemma, is a trade-off, and you can't get everything. You can't get all the options. So in a dilemma, you have two things, can't have both. Got to give up one. In a trilemma, there are three things, but you can't have all three. You can't have all three. You got to sacrifice one so you can have the other two. And this here we call the blockchain trilemma, but it applies to all distributed ledgers. It applies to networks, payment networks of all kinds. So today we'll look at it as it pertains to cryptocurrencies in general, but it does apply more broadly. And actually, it probably would be helpful to look at how it applies to the payment systems we've used in the world before cryptocurrencies even existed, so you get a sense of how it works. So let me start by highlighting a network that has high security, high decentralization, but very little scalability. So an example of that, ooh, great marker. Okay, you guys can see it. Yeah. Okay, an example of this. What's really hard to counterfeit? Really hard to counterfeit. Anybody can acquire it, use it, store it, move it around, anybody, but you can't transact with it very quickly and you can't do many transactions per second. Gold. Gold. Definitely. You can pause and think about that. Let me switch markers. What's an example of a very secure payment network that is highly, highly scalable, but is not decentralized? Right, what's an example of this? Very, very scalable, very secure, but is not decentralized, right? Very, very centralized. What's an example of that? US dollars. US dollars, or really any sovereign currency ever, right? It's issued by a central bank or a centralized government or some centralized institution. Presumably it's pretty secure. It's going to be hard to counterfeit whatever they come up with. And it's very, very scalable. You can process a lot of transactions per second. Everybody all over the country or region can be using it at the same time. No bottlenecks there. And just for sake of completing the triangle, what is really scalable and completely decentralized, meaning anybody can do it at any time, no permission, and they can do it very quickly, but there's no guarantee that it's secure? What's that? If you've never thought about this, one's a little tougher to come up with. So you can do it very quickly. Anybody can do it, but it's not secure. Like, you don't have any guarantees that it's going to be authentic or genuine or accurate or anything like that. Barter, right? Just trading with each other, just peer-to-peer. Anybody can do it at any time, don't need any permission. You can do it very quickly. Everybody on the planet can be trading with each other at all times, and there's no bottlenecks in the system. But there's no security there, because you might be trading, things that don't work, broken goods, spoiled goods, stolen goods, etc. So there's no guarantee that you have security, and of course, there's no recourse in and of a transaction itself. If you want recourse, you have to use the legal system, most likely, but the legal system is a different system than the barter system, and the legal system is obviously centralized and whatever else, so it's a different system. So very, very interesting to ponder. I definitely recommend you pause the video and think about it. So let's look at it in the crypto space. Okay, so which crypto has really high security, is completely decentralized, meaning anybody can do anything on the network at any time, right? You can mine or you can not mine. You can send a transaction or not send a transaction. You can be a merchant or not a merchant. You can be a developer or not a developer. You can do anything at any time or stop doing anything at any time. But it's not scalable. I think you guys know which one that is. BTC, Bitcoin. Yes. What's an example of a crypto that has really high security, really high scalability, but is not decentralized? Now, if I pick your favorite coin, you're going to be pissed. Everyone thinks their coin is decentralized, and actually that's what this video is for. It's to encourage you to think about the fact that maybe it isn't as decentralized as you think. So tell you what, why don't we leave these blank for right now? We'll move on to this, then we'll come back to this thing, and then we'll come back to our triangle. So let's talk about decentralization and the logical fallacy I see people make. So when we talk about a logical fallacy, it's basically something where you try to make an argument. You say this, and therefore this, right? Step 1, step 2, and therefore some conclusion. But you don't reason in a sound way. You have some flaw in your thinking. That's a fallacy. And there's one particular fallacy that people make in terms of decentralization, and I want to give you an example that does not have to do with decentralization, but it's the same logical fallacy. Okay, so let me set the mic down. I'm going to take off these pieces of paper, and you can study this argument. I'll read it out loud, and you can study this argument and see if you can spot the flaw. What's the flaw in the argument? Hang on. Okay, here we go. So here's an argument. Premise 1. A person who owns 1 penny is not rich. A person who owns 1 penny is not rich. So agree or disagree? I think you'll agree with me. Premise 2. A person who owns 1 more penny, and this is not rich. And this asterisk is just because I ran out of room here. So a person who owns 1 more penny than a not rich person is also not rich. Okay? So like if you see a person and that person's not rich, having 1 more penny than that person isn't going to make you rich either. Right? So just 1 penny isn't enough to make a difference. Okay? I think you'll agree with that, but you tell me. Therefore, right, here's our conclusion. A person who owns 100 billion pennies is not rich. A person who owns 100 billion pennies is not rich. Right? And this conclusion follows logically from the premises, right? We said if you only have 1 penny, you're not rich. And if you have only 1 penny more than a not rich person, you're still not rich. So if you only have 2 pennies, you're not rich. And if you have 3 pennies, you're not rich. And if you have 4 pennies, you're not rich. And you can keep going. Just adding 1 penny doesn't all of a sudden make you rich. So you can keep going as high as you want. Go to 100 billion, you're still not rich. But if we think about 100 billion pennies, that's $1 billion, $1 billion. Right? If someone has $1 billion, right, in the year 2020, I would say they're rich. Right? I think you'll agree with that. So probably at first glance, you agree with me, and then you disagree with this. So if you need to, pause the video and figure out what is going on here. What's the problem? Because it sounds convincing the way we build this argument. This sounds good, but then wait a minute, this is fishy. So if you need to, pause the video, think about what's going on. Okay, so I hope you paused the video and thought about it, because that's how you're gonna learn and grow. And this logical fallacy we see all the time in the world, especially when it comes to the word decentralization. So the fallacy here is the fallacy of redefinition. The fallacy of redefinition. We're changing our definition. We're redefining our definition, in this case of the word rich. We're redefining it from one sentence to the next, but we're using it throughout the argument as if it had the same definition. But we're changing it. Can't do that. You can't build an argument that way. That's how you arrive at nonsensical conclusions, right? And this is what happens with decentralization. So people use the word decentralization, and if they define it at the beginning, okay, that's great, but then they switch the definition as they go. So let's look here. Basically, I'm going to make the point that when people talk about decentralization versus centralization, they switch in the middle of their discussion to talk about concentration versus not concentrated. So you'll see what I mean in just a second. Okay, so really what's going on, usually you'll find a sentence on some crypto's website like, oh, we want to be decentralized, and so we're increasing the number of supernodes so that we're more decentralized, and this will help achieve decentralization, right? They'll use that word a few times in several consecutive sentences, but the definition switches from one sentence to the next. And to be honest, I don't think most people realize they're doing this. So I don't exactly blame them. However, it's been going on for years, and I cannot believe how people don't spot the logical fallacy. Actually, I can believe it because we're not taught about these. We're not taught about these in school, and that bothers me to no end. Discussion for another day. Okay, so what is decentralization actually? Well, decentralization basically means that every participant in a network can perform, not does, but can perform every role at every point in time and has free choice. So there's no permission, there's no hierarchy, there's no preferential treatment, there's no prioritization of resources in a certain way. It's basically equality. And you can think of it as a completely flat line. Let me stand on this side. So in a decentralized system, it's completely flat. In a centralized system, you have some type of hierarchy. Doesn't really matter how many levels, it's just more than one level. And that's decentralization versus centralization. The way a lot of people use the word decentralization is they're talking about not concentrated or less concentrated as opposed to more concentrated. And these are completely different things. And when you switch from one definition to another, you're basically committing this logical fallacy here, but it's just not as obvious when it's in a paragraph form or it's written in a white paper or in a tweet or whatever. It's really hard to detect, and it sounds good on the surface unless you're like analyzing it pretty detailedly. Okay, so if you have a decentralized network that is also not concentrated, you could imagine the participants kind of look like this. They're in a straight line and they're spread out, meaning they're not grouped together in any special way. If you have a decentralized network that is concentrated, basically they'll be in a horizontal line, but they'll be bunched in a certain way. So you can see like a group of three, one, group of four. This is sort of like the Bitcoin network, right? All the miners have the same treatment as each other, but they form groups. They form mining pools. And we might even say that, okay, this is a mining pool, this is a mining pool, that's a mining pool, that's a mining pool, and maybe these ones are in the same country, for example, China, and maybe these ones are somewhere else, like United States, Brazil, wherever, it doesn't matter. And we could step back and look at this and say that the power is concentrated in a certain group that constitutes a majority, right? 6 dots here as opposed to 5. But that's just a feature of grouping, and that's a concentration of power. And concentration of power affects security. It does not affect decentralization. It's only decentralization versus centralization that affects decentralization. If you don't believe me, we'll explore that in just one second. Okay, so that's these two. Centralization has some type of hierarchy. You can be centralized and not concentrated, which means you just have more than one level. Doesn't matter, I've drawn it with 3. And all the dots are kind of spread out, so there's no particular grouping at any given level. And finally, you can have a centralized network that is highly concentrated, and you've got more than one level, and you've got different groups, and this could be any number of things. It could be pools or just whatever. So hopefully that makes sense. You might still be wondering, well, okay, why are we defining decentralization as this distinction, hierarchy or not? Why don't we just define decentralization as concentration? Because if we define it as concentration, then my favorite crypto project is actually decentralized. Well, okay, so good question, right? And really the question is getting at, am I just choosing a definition right now that is convenient to me, right? The fallacy of convenience, where you just choose something convenient to you, it's not actually accurate. Well, let's explore exactly that. What if we kind of like switched the words but kept the diagram the same? In other words, what if we called this decentralized, right, not concentrated, or less concentrated, and what if we called this centralized, and vice versa? Well, what would happen? Well, we've got a lot of crypto projects that are essentially, they've got two tiers of nodes or validators or representatives or whatever they have on the system. They've got basically run-of-the-mill nodes, and then they've got super nodes, let's call it that. And so there's a hierarchy there. It's only 2 levels, but there's still a hierarchy. That's the point. So I would call that centralized. But what if we flip the definition around and, switch centralized and concentrated? Well, let's think it through. If we take our number of supernodes, and let's say we have 20, and we increase it to 30, I would argue you're just making it less concentrated, which is useful, right? Because you're going to improve the security of your model, right? Because your power is less concentrated. However, your decentralization hasn't changed. That's according to my definition, which I think is more helpful, let's say. If we have the opposite definition, right, and we're looking at going from 20 nodes to 20 supernodes to 30 supernodes, and we've become more decentralized. Okay, let's go here. If we go from 20 to 30 supernodes and we become more decentralized, so we've somehow increased our decentralization. Hopefully you guys can see this. I'm just drawing an arrow. Well, since we have the power a little bit divided among the supernodes, we've also increased our security, right? Because it's going to be harder to take over the network. So our security goes up, right? Our corner of our little triangle goes further into the corner of the big triangle. And if we go from 20 to 30 supernodes, then we'll be able to process transactions faster because we have more of these supernodes communicating with each other, and our scalability goes up too. So with that definition of just looking at concentration, we've defined it in such a way that going from 20 to 30 supernodes increases our decentralization, increases our security, and increases our scalability. So we get all 3. So that's a fallacy that's very similar to this one down here, where you're just choosing a ridiculous definition that allows you to increase all 3 aspects of a trilemma at the same time, which is a fallacy. I mean, you just can't do that. So I think you've got to look at it this way, which is the accurate way. The whole point of this trilemma, why it's actually a trade-off between the 3, is because if you decentralize it this way, you get decentralization. If you structure it this way, you give up decentralization, which is fine, right? There's a lot of reasons for doing that, but you got to be honest about it, right? We'll get there in a second. So, okay. So when you have 2 tiers of nodes, let's say 2 or more, you're centralized, meaning you've given this up. You've given up decentralization. The reason you did that, the reason you have nodes and supernodes or whatever you call them, the reason you gave up decentralization is so you could get scalability. That was the design choice. That's why you have 2 tiers. That's why you've got your basic nodes and your supernodes. So I think a lot of people don't understand this trilemma, and I would encourage you, when you're on a crypto website or you're reading a white paper or you're reading something on Medium written by the founder of the company or the CTO or the whatever, or just some random analyst, when you're reading these things, if you see a coin that is claiming to be the most secure, most scalable, and most decentralized coin, you know they're full of it. They're just full of it. They might not realize they're full of it, actually, I think. I think most of those, I mean, I don't want to call them scams because I think that's too harsh, but I think most of the coins claiming to have all three legitimately don't understand that you can't. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. It doesn't matter because I stay away from them regardless. But there are definitely some out there who know you can't have all three, but are still claiming it anyways. So that's number one. Don't be fooled by people out there. Number two, don't perpetuate this myth about your favorite coin, and don't pretend that it's something that it isn't. I think that's irresponsible, and you just kind of look silly to anyone who knows what they're talking about. Not only that, but you're probably latching onto a certain belief or a certain coin because you've staked your reputation on it, not because you thought critically about it. So I think the people who are going to get burned the most in crypto are the ones who are stubborn and the ones who are not open-minded, but who think they are. That's the biggest problem, is thinking you're open-minded and not being open-minded. And then number three, the last thing I want to say, I want to go back to Bitcoin. And people say that, okay, because the mining is concentrated in China, that means Bitcoin is no longer decentralized. And that, of course, is absurd because all the miners have the same authority. They have the same power at all times. It's a completely flat power structure. The concentration emerged naturally, and if it disappears, it might not, but if it disappears, it will disappear naturally. There's no authority that says we got to break up these mining pools, or we got to, there's no, and you don't get any particular advantage. There's no such thing as a super node on Bitcoin. There's no node that has more power than any other. So everything's the same. So I will agree that this concentration of power has lowered the security of Bitcoin. Yeah, for sure. It's a security risk, right? It makes security go down when all the hashing power is concentrated in a particular geography or mining pool or whatever. Yeah, that makes the security go down. It does not affect decentralization at all. It doesn't make decentralization go down. It hasn't changed at all. And so that's super important to understand. In my next video, I'm going to talk about why, I got to finish this. Basically, in this green box, I would say is every other crypto, pretty much. It's maybe a slight oversimplification, but pretty much all of them would fit into this green box. And pretty much every sovereign currency and currency of other type would also go in this green box. And so in my next video, I'm going to elaborate on the difference between this green box here and this red box down here. We're basically going to ignore the blue one. And I'm going to talk about what is the difference between these, which I will call currencies, and these things down here like gold or Bitcoin, which I will call money, why I'm using those words, how I'm defining them, how other people commit fallacies, and which one you want to have and under which circumstances, because they're both good, right? They both have strengths and weaknesses. And I'll go into depth big time in my next video. So if you guys learned something, smash the likes, hit that thumbs up, and I encourage you to spend some time thinking about what I've said here. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I've been thinking about this stuff for months, years, and it's only now that I feel comfortable making a video on it. So I would encourage you to take as much time as you need, hours, days, weeks, months, whatever. Come back, leave me a comment, challenge my thinking. Maybe I've committed a fallacy and I don't realize it. I promise I didn't do it on purpose, but we all make mistakes. So improve my thinking, leave a message in the comment section. Find me on Twitter at Alan Hibbard. My handle will be in the description. And if you want to see my next videos, make sure you subscribe. Thanks, guys.